On the occasion of International Donor Conception Awareness Day, I welcome you to an interactive panel discussion on the topic, Leading by Example Through Transparency, Your Donor-Conceived Child's First Lesson in Trust. I am Sarah Ramaya, Curriculum Design Strategist and Webinar Coordinator at ASRM. Before I welcome and introduce our panelists, please note this webinar was developed by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine in collaboration with the Right to Know, an organization focused on donor-conceived persons, as an educational resource and service to its members and other reproductive professionals. While this webinar reflects the views of the panelists, it is not intended to be the only approved standard of practice or to dictate an exclusive course of treatment. Members should always use their best judgment in determining a course of action and be guided by the needs of the individual patient, available resources, and institutional or clinical practice limitations. Participation by the presenters does not reflect an endorsement of ASRM and its legislative policies. Also, please note that this webinar is recorded. All attendees will be muted except the panelists. This is a discussion and not a presentation, so please feel free to type a question in the Q&A window or the chat window at any time. We will read as many selected questions as possible to the panelists. And like I mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be archived on the ASRM website in the coming weeks. Please watch your email for notification. Before I pass the session over to Joni Mantell, our moderator, I have a quick poll to test our audience.
Hi, I'm Joni Mantell. I'm founder and director of the Infertility and Adoption Counseling Center, and I have been practicing as a psychotherapist with specialties in these areas for about 30 years when I learned from a DNA test that I too am donor conceived. This was about 4 years ago. So now my experience is both professional and personal. I've always been a proponent of open communication between parents and children, but now I understand in a deeper way how really critical this is. So currently, I'm really passionate about helping gamete recipient parents gain the confidence they need to be open with their children. As we know, professionally, the recommendation is for parents to tell their children about their donor conception early and often. But what we're seeing clinically as therapists working with families is that many parents actually delay telling. They struggle with how and when to tell. They have fears about telling, and some parents never get around to telling because of their fears. We get calls about this every week from parents struggling and wanting help gaining the confidence they need to talk with their children. In speaking with these parents, we've seen 4 key fears that they have about talking with their kids. The most common are anxiety about people knowing about their infertility and judging them, fears that grandparents or other relatives will treat the children less favorably than genetically connected grandchildren, fears that telling the children will disrupt the positive parent-child relationship, especially with the genetically not related parent. There's great anxiety there. And probably the most common fear is the basic that if we talk about this, it's going to upset our kids. Everything's fine. Why go there? And as you will hear from the panelists, this could not be farther from the truth. You're going to hear that the donor-conceived person actually welcomes hearing the truth from their parents. It's secrecy and having their feelings minimized that they find really upsetting and frankly unfair. So I want to reassure parents that children that grow up knowing about their genetic identity are not known to reject their non-genetic parent. Parents' day-to-day, year-to-year relationships with their kids are deeply bonded. That's real time and that's real emotion and real relationship. So from what I've seen clinically and even in adoption where there's open adoption and kids meet their biological parents at younger ages, the child's curiosity about the birth parent in adoption or the donor in donor conception is not a sign of their rejection of the parent. They're not looking for another parent. They're just curious about their own identity. They want more information about who they are, what's their nature, what's their nurture, because so much is genetic. And so, last, I would say, or hope we could all share with parents, talking with their kids about sensitive topics is actually going to make them closer. This is how we get close with our kids. We talk about things. And so I'm really excited for you as an audience to hear the voices of this panel. And I'm really hoping that their perspectives can be shared with recipient parents to help them feel more confident communicating with their kids. After the panel, I'm going to share some data, and then we're hoping to have some time for your questions. So now I pass this along to Erin.
Hi, everyone. So happy and honored to be here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Erin Maya. I am a late discovery donor-conceived person. I would say that my story begins before I was born. My parents were engaged, and my father, who raised me, had his first cancer diagnosis. He went through radiation, he went through chemotherapy, very stressful for two young people who were about to just start embarking on their lives together. So when my father went into remission, it was time for my parents to start moving on with their lives and building a family. And what they found was that because of the chemotherapy, my father was not going to be able to have children naturally. And this was completely devastating. So they went to a fertility clinic. They saw a doctor, and it was decided that they were going to do artificial insemination and use a sperm donor. Both of my parents are Irish Catholic with beautiful blue eyes. And so the doctor said that he would find a donor that looked like my dad. This way they didn't feel like they were playing God or anything. And basically they would do the insemination, and then my parents should just continue trying to conceive naturally. And if they were to get pregnant, just assume that the child is my dad's and the child didn't have to know anything. They could just move on with their lives. This tends to be a practice that I hear from a lot of donor-conceived people. Their parents were told by doctors that the child doesn't need to know. So I was born with my big brown eyes and my darker features. And as a child, I always felt like I was kind of like an outsider. I definitely felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it. I have a very specific memory of around Christmas time, me and my Irish cousins, we would all get together and we would take a group photo every year. And I remember as a child looking at that photo and seeing the sea of blue eyes and blonde or red hair, light brown hair. And I remember thinking like, I stand out, and it didn't feel good. And I wondered sort of like where my eyes came from. So what ended up happening was my dad's cancer ended up returning, and it came back again and again and again. He had like the worst luck when it came to health. And so for the first 11 years of my life, I had a sick parent, and he ended up passing away when I was 11 years old, unfortunately. So 3 years later, I was talking with my mom one day, and I told her how much it bothered me that people would always ask me, like, tell me, you and your brother look nothing alike. You know, your brother looks so much like your dad. My brother has blue eyes as well. Your brother looks so much like your dad, but you guys don't even look like brother and sister. And that used to bother me so much. Because when you're building your identity, one of the first foundational things that you're looking at as a child, as a preteen young person, is you're seeing where you belong in your family unit, you know? So that was really confusing and frustrating to me. And so it was in that moment that my mom decided to tell me that I was actually donor conceived. My brother was actually donor conceived as well, but they chose the donor. So he had like an Irish donor. But for me, being the oldest, I was a wild card because the doctor chose the donor. So I felt like my world had just turned upside down. It felt like a movie. My dad had just passed away 3 years ago, and now I find out that biologically he wasn't my dad. It was devastating. But my first thing that I wanted to know was, oh my God, like this kind of makes sense. So what am I? Like, what's my background? And unfortunately, there was no information to be had because they used an anonymous donor and the doctor chose the donor. So my mom tried to get information from the clinic, but they had absolutely nothing. And commercial DNA testing wasn't available back then. So for the first 16 years of my life, I was half question mark. And that really affected my self-esteem and really affected my sense of the truth and of trust in general in life. It definitely affected me, when you're a teenager and you're coming into your young adulthood. Those are really important times in building your identity, and everybody is figuring out, who am I in this world? And I felt very much like I was stuck at square one because my very foundation had been taken from me and I didn't know. So anyway, when I turned 30 years old, I finally decided enough is enough. I'm going to take one of these DNA tests and find out what I am. And so when the results came back, I found out I was 63% Cuban by way of Spanish. And all of this made so much sense to me. But there was definitely a lot of grief as well, because this was a culture I never got to be a part of, that I felt very connected to, just in a way that I can't describe. I just always kind of felt connected to the Latino community. But I didn't get to really grow up with that. And it was just kind of hard not knowing that, not having that information. I decided I wanted to find my donor just to get more information. So for the next 3 years, I searched to try to find my donor. I did end up finding him, and he did reject connection or communication, which was really hard. So basically what it came down to is I had to do a lot of my own inner work and to try to find inner peace about my identity. But I was really, really glad, even though it didn't have the ending that I hoped for, I was really glad that I did end up finding my donor, and I did end up finding out about my genetic identity, because it really finally put those last pieces of the puzzle together so that I can go on and write my own story, if that makes sense. My mom and I, we've had in the beginning of when I first found out that I was donor conceived at 14, she really didn't want to talk about it, and we didn't talk about it at all. No one in the family knew. It was very much a secret. And over the years, when I started to ask about it, it's a little tense, but eventually she saw how much it meant to me. And especially when I took that DNA test and she saw the results, she was just as surprised as I was, because the doctor said he was going to pick a donor just like my dad. So it was then that I think my mom understood how important it was that I get all of these tools in my toolbox, so to say. And so now my mom is completely 100% supportive of my journey as a donor conceived person and finding my full identity. And I can't even tell you how much that means to me. It's like the biggest representation of love to me that my mom supports me on this donor conceived journey. I really want to share my story with parents because, unfortunately my dad passed. So this is a conversation I'll never get to have with him. And I really wish I would have been able to have with him. And so that's why I think it's really important to have these conversations with your kids, or if your kids are adults now, as soon as possible, because once you're gone, the kids have to figure out for themselves how to get that sort of peace. And I'll always wonder how my dad would have reacted. But at the end of the day, I know that my dad really loved me. And I think that he would have wanted whatever was going to be best for me. I also can say that I'm really, really glad that my dad was my parent who raised me, because he was a great man. And just because I'm donor conceived and interested in finding my donor and wanting to connect with him doesn't mean I'm looking for a new parent. There's no comparison. It's just another part of who I am. So I hope that you can learn from my story and understand how important the truth is, and understand that in supporting your child and giving them these tools for their toolbox, it's actually going to make them feel even more loved and supported by you. And we're in this era of transparency right now with the internet, and with people's identities being very, very important. What they call themselves is very important. And so any way that you can support that is going to be the best way forward. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to pass the mic to Dan.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everybody. My name is Dan McKinnon. I'm a late discovery donor conceived person. I live in Toronto with my wife and our dog Waffles. And I have known the truth of my identity for 15 months as of Monday, May the 1st. I got here in a bit of an interesting way. It really, the roots of my discovery really begin at the start of the pandemic. I'm a professional musician, and at the time, everything had shut down. The world had completely closed, and for the very first time in a number of years, I didn't have gigs to play, and I was stuck at home. And at that time, I really began to do a lot of personal work as it relates to my family, my raising family. I grew up and was raised as an only child with my two parents. But I was raised predominantly around my mother's side of the family, aunts and uncles, cousins, and my grandparents. And my mother's side of the family, I can now look back on and say was psychologically and emotionally turbulent. I remember very early on being very afraid of, like, my grandfather, for instance. He was like the head of the family and ruled with an iron fist. And at the start of the pandemic, I really started to lean into doing a lot of this personal work, spending a lot of time on YouTube, reading Psychology Today articles about topics like family systems theory, intergenerational trauma, and narcissistic personality disorder. And as I was doing a lot of this work and learning more about this family system I was raised in, I became more and more interested in learning more about my dad's side of the family. And my dad's side lived on the other side of Canada from us, so we would only maybe see them about once a year. But his family was also a real bit of a mystery. You know, any time as a kid when I want to learn more about, my McKinnon side, the subject was always avoided. And on my dad's side too, he inherited the McKinnon last name from his stepfather, because his biological father passed away when my dad was very, very young, around 4 to 5 years of age. So I initially started doing some of the research on ancestry, let's say looking at obituaries and newspaper articles, things like that, where I discovered that my name Dan came from my dad's stepfather's father. So my dad's step-grandfather. And that was the first I had ever heard about that. And after thinking about doing a commercial DNA test for a number of years, I finally made the decision during Black Friday 2020 to do it. So I was thinking about a number of different websites to choose, but I specifically chose Ancestry DNA because in doing some this research, I discovered that my dad's sister found a long-lost niece when she took an Ancestry DNA test. Because my dad's mother in the 1940s had a baby boy that she gave up for adoption, who had a family of his own, and my aunt connected with this niece of hers. So on my perspective, I thought, well, I'm going to find some cousins, and I'm going to finally get to know more about my my dad's side of the family that had long been a mystery. And then also at the time here in Toronto, with our COVID restrictions, we were under a government lockdown that was so strict that shopping at Home Depot in person was actually illegal. So I thought, well, I have 8 weeks to pass the time and get this test, and hopefully by that point the world will have opened up. So I got my test results at 8:37 p.m. on February the 1st of 2021. And I was sitting upstairs on my couch watching the Maple Blues award show that I watch every year in person, but this year it was digital. And I was sitting next to my wife, and I mentioned, "Oh, I got the alert." I open my Ancestry DNA app, and the first thing I see is my DNA story. And I can see the Italian side that's accounted for, but the most dominant side was 50% Eastern European Jewish. And nobody in my family, my raising family, was Jewish. So that just didn't make any sense to me. Then the following page, I see my matches. And there were 3 things that were especially concerning when I saw my matches. The first was that I saw 2 strangers listed as close family that I never seen before and never heard before. The second thing was that I had a first cousin I knew all my life that I was matched with. And we had our shared centimorgans, which is a unit that is used to measure DNA. Our shared centimorgans were like a third of these other 2 strangers. And then the third and most concerning thing was that I didn't see anybody on my dad's side of the family. And again, I specifically chose Ancestry because I knew that my dad's sister tested on Ancestry DNA. So as this was going down, I thought I was about to have a heart attack. Like nothing about this made sense. So my wife was on the other side of me, trying to mention like, "Oh, you must be reading these results wrong. Like there must be something here that you're just not seeing." So she was on her phone, and then she went upstairs to our bedroom where her iPad was, and she's sending me articles in real time as I'm having like a full-blown panic attack. So I then decide to message these 2 strangers on the Ancestry app. But then when I look at their profiles, it said, "Last time signed in over a year ago." And I couldn't wait over a year. I basically needed to know right then and there what was happening. And I was able to find one of the 2 strangers on Facebook. So I sent a friend request. That was accepted very, very fast. And then I also received a friend request from the second person that I had been connected to. And I sent them both a message saying, I'm so happy to connect with you, but I really do not understand why we have been matched. And the 2 of them in the most gentle way, they wrote me and said, "We were born in Winnipeg, Manitoba on these dates. Our parents struggled with infertility and they used a sperm donor in order to have us." So they talked about their stories and they left it to me to put, the 2 and 2 together. And in between getting that news and opening my email, it was about 15 minutes. And I'll never forget running upstairs telling my wife, it turns out I'm a donor conceived person and that, my dad is not my biological father. And I have to say that looking back almost 15 months now, I would have to tell you that this discovery has been so complex and so multi-layered. But that being said, I'm happy that I have the truth. When I was a kid, similar to Aaron, I had a feeling all of my life that something was off, that something just didn't seem right. And I never saw myself reflected in my surroundings. My love of music and the performing arts I didn't see that in either side of the family. And from a very early age, I taught myself to betray my conscious, to betray my internal feelings about myself and my surroundings. Because all I saw, my surroundings betrayed what I felt inside. And it got so bad to a point where almost about a year and a half before I had my discovery, I had this almost awakening of this feeling in my body that was telling me something is wrong and you can't ignore it anymore, which really started this journey. And after I found out the truth, it certainly made so many parts of my life make sense for the very first time. One of the most, and one of the things actually I should say that I've come across when discussing and getting to know other late discovery donor conceived people is that often we have these like flashbacks of moments where we may have, we may have seen a clue, or we may have had a tip about the actual truth of our origins. And for me, the most dominant memory actually took place at my wedding. And my parents gave, of course, parents give speeches at weddings. And my dad was the one who gave the speech on behalf of my parents at my wedding. And after he had his little introduction, he starts by saying, "We realized from a very young age that when Dan was a kid, that he was different." And I actually was different. Like, I was very independent. I really marched to the beat of my own drum. And I also had a real hard time fitting in with friends and peer groups and things like that. Like, that was a struggle I dealt with all throughout childhood, and especially during adolescence and when I was a young adult. But the fact of the matter remains is that, yes, I actually was different. I was donor conceived. And as I've come to know my newly discovered genetic family, I just realized that I actually never was different. I'm just so much like my biological father and my siblings. It's actually, as I've gotten to know my newly discovered family, it's been the greatest gift in this experience. But it's all been worth it. But I will say that it is, like I mentioned, it is a very complex discovery. One of the things that a lot of late discovery donor conceived people hear, or anyone who has a misattributed parent event happen later in life, is often people will say, "You're still you," and that couldn't be further from the truth. Because with the truth, I can tell you all that I'm a fundamentally different person, and I'm a better version of myself because I'm able to connect with who I am internally, because I know that all those feelings that I had as a kid, it wasn't my fault. It was just because I didn't have the complete information. That being said, I am managing this discovery for the rest of my life. I have to deal with new mental health challenges now in the wake of my discovery. I was really struggling this past summer, and I took the initiative to see a clinical psychologist for a full evaluation. And it was there where I learned that I have post-traumatic stress disorder related to this discovery. I have not been able to sleep a single night soundly since my discovery without the use of cannabis. And most nights I rarely ever sleep through the night. Most often I actually wake up and check to make sure all the doors are locked, because I'm always wondering what the next big bomb to drop is. These are new challenges that I never experienced before my discovery that I now have to navigate because of this information. And I do have a long road ahead. I'm still only 15 months in. But I do find that the more I lean into the truth, and the more I lean into telling and sharing the story, the better and stronger I feel about my journey and the more secure and whole I feel in myself. I'm still not fully out with in my circle. Close friends know, my family knows, but I'm looking forward to the day when I can go on my Facebook page and fully live with this information in the light. But that is a big part. That is a significant part of my story. There's more I want to share with you all later in this webinar. I thank you for your attention and for your listening. And at this point, I'd like to pass the baton over to Terry.
Hello. So I guess my story really just started. Sorry, getting a little emotional. Good emotions. My story began with my mother. When my mother was trying to get pregnant, she was 37 years old and decided that she wanted to have a child. In being a single mother by choice, she and my grandmother ended up raising me. She had problems with infertility because her fallopian tubes were blocked. Sorry, I'm just getting anxious. When my mother was 37 years old, she decided to have the child. And to do so, she had to go through a sperm donor. She went to an infertility clinic, and they directed her to a sperm bank so that she and my grandmother can make the decision as to what sperm donor they wanted for me. I am Irish and Italian, and they picked an Irish and Italian donor as well. And growing up, I remember always knowing that my family structure was a little bit different. And it never really bothered me. My mother was always open and honest with me whenever I asked her questions about it. If I ever said, oh, like, why do all my friends have fathers and I just have you and Nana? It was expressed to me that, you know, a doctor helped her get pregnant and that I was a gift, that I was wanted, that I was loved, and that I would always be supported by that because they were my family. And as I grew older, I began to ask more questions. I became more curious. Since this was introduced to me at such a young age, I really feel like it gave me the freedom to explore my own relationship with it. And when I was around 8 or 9 years old, I remember really questioning for the first time, like, who my father was and, you know, who else related to me and was really like me in that sense. And it was then when I asked my mother if I had any half-siblings, if she knew who my donor father was. And I'm very thankful because she always answered the questions that I asked her and didn't make it any more complicated than that. But she allowed me to ask whatever questions I needed. So when I was hoping I could find my half-siblings, she was ready with the information to go onto the website and look at the registry and see if there was anyone else that could be related to. And when I asked her questions about who my donor father was, she replied with, I don't know his name. I don't know if we will, but I have this sheet of paper with information about how tall he was and, you know, what he could have looked like. She had a recording of his voice they gave from the cryobank, but no other information. He was 3285, which was his donor number for most of my life. And in 3285, I bonded with a lot of my half-siblings. There were really 5 of us that connected to begin with. But the first 2 I met when I was 9 years old, and their parents brought them up, and my mother, we met at, I believe, at Applebee's for lunch. But it was such a good experience because my mother allowed me to get to know them and get to experience my own connection with them. And physically being there with me as a child allowed me to explore this side of myself, showed me that I could trust her to be there and to let me continue on and explore this side of myself. But if I'm being honest, it really felt like a lot was still unknown, even though all this information was given to me from an age where, I could ask the question. It did feel at times that I didn't know where I would go from there, and what else I could know. But it never felt negative. To me, it felt like a journey of curiosity that lay ahead of me. Through forming relationships with my half siblings and going on vacations and like meeting up over summers and stuff, I really grew to see the similarities between us that I never saw with myself and my family. They're small things. They're seemingly insignificant things to other people. You may not notice them, but there's a feeling that there's something more to you than those around you. And although you are loved and supported, to be able to explore it freely and truly write your own story within that is something so special and so important to who I am. And I was lucky enough through the help of 23andMe. Me and my sister both did 23andMe, and one day she called me up and she said, "We have someone related to us." And it ended up being my cousin on my father's side and my uncle on my father's side. And through, a string of intense messages, we were able to connect with him. And I was luckily able to meet him just once. And I remember my reflecting really about what I wanted to get out of our interaction and what being donor conceived really meant to me in that moment when I was coming face to face with this big question mark in my life. And I remember thinking about nature versus nurture. That was a big question that always resonated with me. And in being able to see side by side all of the contributions from my mother and my grandmother and all those that loved me, who raised me and made me who I am, while simultaneously being able to just glimpse into the life of someone who was also half of me, was such a heartwarming experience. It showed me that both of them are important and both of them are they contribute so much to who you are and how you relate to the world. When I met him, certain mannerisms were just the same. There were certain words that didn't have to go on, that could go unsaid when we were talking to each other. And my mother was, in the car behind me while I was talking with him, and waiting for me to come back. And in having her from the very start be open and proud that I was, donor conceived, that, this was a gift that was given to her from a nice man and a nice doctor who helped her have me. And that message was always supported by, I can try to answer whatever questions you have. I can support you in however you want to connect with your other side of the family. And to be honest with you, I think it made us grow closer as a mother-daughter unit. And in my family unit, to know that in her story, she wanted me so badly that she would give everything to have me. And, to have that and have her say, go ahead, take it from there. You're free to have a relationship with whoever you want, and be free to have more family. And in having my half siblings there the whole time, I never felt alone. Even if they were far away, spread out all over the country, I really always knew that I did belong. And I belonged both within my family that raised me and within the extended family that was on my father's side. So if I have to say one thing to everybody, it is to just be open, be honest from as early as you can, because you will allow your child to have a deeper relationship with both sides of who they are, no matter if they get to meet the donor or not. Being able to explore that is so, so important. So, yeah, I guess that's my story. Back to you, Joey.
Thank you all. And I know that the audience must have questions for the panelists. And after I flip through this data, there will be time for that. Each of you contributed just the points that are so meaningful, and it was really heartwarming to listen to each of you. So thank you. Now we're going to look at some data. The first slide is a recent study that had 486 responses from recipient parents. And as you can see, they were asked, have you disclosed to your child at this time? A very small percent, the orange, 5% recipient parents, had no plans of ever disclosing. And that's not a large number, but I think it's still surprising given the ease of at-home DNA testing. The yellow, 42% of recipient parents said they were planning to tell. And then we see the blue bar, only 25% have disclosed at this time of the survey. The green bar is that 30% had not disclosed, and they would be considered to be on the fence. They're waiting, they're trying to figure out what the right time to tell is. And what we have learned is that waiting makes it harder, so they may or may not tell. We're not really sure. So I think that, next slide. Okay, so if we ask, are parents disclosing, we can say, well, secrecy still exists. When and whether to tell is presented actually as a debate. The ASRM statement is disclosure to donor-conceived persons of the use of donor gametes or embryos in their conception is strongly encouraged, while ultimately the choice of recipient parents. Debatable. 51% of donor-conceived people found out they were donor-conceived from an over-the-counter DNA test, and 80% were surprised by that discovery. I think we need to look at this in context. Currently, recipient parents do not receive a lot of education about the importance of openness. Typically, they have a one-time 90-minute mental health consultation prior to becoming pregnant. So while they're at that consultation, they're very anxious about whether they really will get pregnant, and it's hard to think as a parent with having a child who has needs and needs for openness. So the other piece of it is 90 minutes is not very long, and in this consultation, many issues are covered. It's not a deep dive into how you're going to tell and talk with your kid. There's a recommendation that they do it early and often, but they don't have a chance to really address how they feel about this and what their fears are. So I think the question for us as professionals is, when and how can these parents learn about talking to their kids? It isn't really clear, and I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed so we can serve these parents better. Next slide. Okay, so family arrangement is the single biggest predictor of openness. 76% of the respondents raised by a single mother or same-sex parents learned they are donor-conceived as a child or infant. Only 9% of the respondents raised by heterosexual parents were told about their origins as an infant or child. And let's just hope those stats are getting better. But as you can see, we're not going to go through all the numbers, but they are going up. Next slide. So why disclose early? It builds trust. It models honesty as a family value. It allows the parent to be the source of support, the one the child goes to ask questions. And as we all know, trust is the basis of any good relationship. Early disclosure provides a true medical history, either access to a medical history that can be helpful to diagnosis and treatment, or truth about the lack of a medical history, which means that the donor-conceived person doesn't have to worry they have the diseases of their non-genetic parent, which many donor-conceived people report. You know, a parent who had a medical issue, they worry they had it. Well, if they're not genetically connected, they don't need to worry about that. Early disclosure helps children understand their nature and nurture. And late discovery can negatively impact the parent-adult-child relationship and result in lasting trauma. I think it's optimal to think about openness in the same context as adoption, because while nurture influences nature, we're all a combination of nature and nurture. And knowing both helps each of us as individuals understand our identity. Next slide. Okay. Early discovery before age 3 is associated with a greater likelihood of feeling positive about being donor conceived in general. Early and late discovery donor conceived persons both are likely to seek information about donor and donor siblings. You can see that on this chart. The importance to know the donor's identity is high in both groups. The importance to know the donor sibling's identity is high in both groups. And the last point, all donor conceived persons should have the option to know their donor's identity. And if we think about that in the context of the current situation, this means that anonymous donors really present a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties in satisfying the needs of the donor conceived person. Next slide. Okay, advice for parents of donor conceived persons. I think you've gotten a lot of advice by listening to the panelists, but I'll go through a little buzz list here. Just to sum it up, tell your children they are donor conceived as young as possible. Practice before they are born. Learn how to talk about donor conception across the ages and stages of your child's development. Parents have to initiate the conversations because parents are saying, well, the kids don't ask. Kids don't have the words to pose their questions or describe their feelings. Parents need to learn the developmental understanding for children and initiate conversations and help them articulate what they may be feeling. Let your child create and live their own story. Do not substitute your own narrative. The parent's narrative may be, we wanted you so much. And yes, of course, most babies are wanted very much. But this is about the parents and the parents' want. It's not about the particular child that was created, the unique way they were created. You want to let your child talk about their own story as they are putting it together. And you want to hold space for their difficult and negative feelings. They're going to have mixed feelings, and you don't want to minimize their story, and you don't want to minimize their anxiety, their curiosity, whatever they're feeling. You want to give them room and not rush them through it. Let it emerge and be there for them. Recognize and embrace the parts of them that are different because of the donor conception. And expect feelings to change and evolve over time. If you haven't told yet as a parent, it's never too late to tell. As I think you're hearing from the panel, children, teens, adults would much rather hear from their parents than learn from a DNA test. And if parents need help with their fears on how to do this, counseling can help. And if parents haven't told by the time their child is in kindergarten at the latest, next slide, I'm sorry. If parents haven't told by the time their child is school age, let's say kindergarten at the latest, that's a sign that it's good to get some counseling. Or if parents are struggling with how to keep the conversation going, of course they are, they have questions. Another good time to seek out a therapist that is savvy to both third-party reproduction and child psychology. We have created a handout on talking to children about donor conception for parents that are telling early and for parents that are telling late. And so this is a link that you can use to get that. And hopefully that will be useful to you. Okay, so that's the wrap on the data. And now we're ready for some questions, either yours or I actually can ask the panel a few questions to get this started. Okay. One of the things that, we might go into a little more deeply is what is your relationship like with your raising family and the donor, if you know the donor now? Dan, do you want to get started with that?
Yeah, sure. With my biological father and my siblings, that discovery could not be better. It has enriched my life in ways that I cannot even begin to describe to you all. I had the opportunity to meet one of my sisters this past fall, and it was so bizarre in the sense that, and I'll echo what Aaron mentioned about the idea of like living in a movie. Like this felt like I was living in a movie where we had met, and after we had, the two of us had been messaging like just about every day since I had found out. And the time that we had together was brief, but I'll never forget when I met her at the airport and gave her a big hug, and we were walking, and then I was driving back to my house. It felt like we had done this a million times before. Even though I had met this person, like logically I had met them 10 minutes before, in person. My newly discovered family has been a very safe place for me. And I'll never forget one of the days that, my early days in my discovery, maybe day 3, I had discovered and been put in contact with my biological father very early on. One of my siblings had found him, in her journey. So, he was readily available for me if I wanted to connect with him. And we exchanged a number of emails, and we talked about the idea of, having a video call one day and meet. And I recall telling him, I said, look, I'm spinning out right now. I'm a complete mess mentally, but I would really like to give you my best when that time happens. And he replied back and mentioned to me, he said, he goes, I hear you. He goes, but I just want you to know that you do not need to be at your best to be accepted by anybody, because who you are is perfect. And my parents never spoke to me that way at all. And it was when I heard that I thought, well, there might be something here. And the more I've invested in getting to know my bio dad and my siblings, I'm just learning more about myself, and it's enriched my life in ways I can't even begin to describe. Now, with regards to my raising family, there is a point that I want, those attending to really take home from this, is that when someone discovers this information later in life, they're not only responsible for managing their emotions, but they're put in an unenviable position of having to manage the emotions of those around them as it relates to their discovery, especially family members that include parents, siblings, aunts and uncles, cousins, and so forth. And one thing I think that we can kind of say, just in general about human nature, is that humans generally resist change. I mean, look how hard it is to even make small lifestyle changes, like changing a diet. When this type of information is out there, family systems more often than not will reject the discovery and the truth. And I have to say that one of the reasons why I found so many online support groups so helpful for me in my discovery was because outside of my DC siblings, it was the only place where my perspective was actually validated. It's the only place where people said, yeah, what you're feeling is normal. And I have to tell you that my raising family have not taken kindly to me finding out this information. Outside of a handful of members, most people would consider me talking on this webinar to all of you as airing dirty family laundry. And that living with my truth is the same thing as exposing the family dysfunction. And regrettably, this is an experience that I've come to learn is not uncommon with late discovery donor-conceived people, and it has been my experience. I'll leave it at that.
Yes, I'll go next.
My relationship with my mom is wonderful. And it definitely has gotten better, and we've gotten even closer once she really came on board supporting me in my journey to finding out more about my DNA and finding my donor. So yeah, I'm really lucky, and I'm very aware that I'm very lucky that my mom is supportive of my journey, because like Dan said, unfortunately, it's not very common. And I understand, I can have empathy for that, because infertility is its own heartbreaking journey. But I guess like what I would say is that, if you do decide to use a donor, the child that's coming out of this is separate from your grief and that infertility journey. And it's easier to give empathy if you're receiving it as well, if that makes any sense. So I have a ton of compassion and empathy for my parents and their infertility journey, because my mom has shown me compassion and empathy as well, if that makes sense. My father's passed, so obviously I am unable to have a relationship presently, but I have nothing but, love towards my father. I'm so glad that he is the parent who raised me, even if it was for a short time. As for my donor, like I mentioned in my story, we do not have a relationship, unfortunately. I would have really been open to having a relationship or a connection of some sort. Obviously not in like a parental context. But, some people, I don't really have anything to say about him. That's his deal. But I am really lucky that some paternal cousins that I matched with have been wonderful. And we've had a really great relationship. And when I met them, it was as if, like what Dan was saying, it was as if we had always known each other. We had the same kind of mannerisms. One of my cousins, the very first one I ever met, it was the first time I ever saw someone with my eyes. And I cannot even express to you what that feels like, to finally see somebody with this part of you that you always wondered where it came from. It's just really reaffirming in a way. So yeah, I would be open to, if my donor ever came around, to having some sort of a connection. But if not, that's totally fine. I am lucky to be surrounded by love. Okay, Terry, you want to go?
Yeah, so my relationship with my mother is great. I feel like we're definitely closer, as I got older and like really grew to understand both sides of my identity as well. And my grandmother also raised me. She passed away when I was 13, but I think my relationship with her was also so strong because of the way I was conceived. And since my family structure was different, I feel like knowing all the information that I did and growing up with that love and support really helped me. Now with my donor side of my family, I'm pretty close to my half siblings, I would say. And I'm going to echo again what Dan and Erin said. When you meet them, it's like you've known each other for so long. And, to be able to have that connection with someone almost instantaneously without even consciously knowing why. But it's just the little things that two people can understand and really connect with each other on, that I see with all of my half siblings in different ways. And also to see the ways that we look alike. We all have the same cheeks, the same cheekbones, all of us. It's such a special experience. And I think that out of all of the connections I've made to the donor side of my family, my half-sibling relationships are the most valued to me. But I also got the privilege to be able to meet my paternal cousin, paternal like an uncle on my father's side, and my biological grandmother on that side as well. I only got to meet them each once in person, but I did exchange a couple of phone calls over a couple of months with my grandmother, and I got to speak to my donor father just once, and a couple of texts afterward. But since then, not at all. I was curious. I would love to have known him more, but I can't say that it bothers me. I'm just so grateful that he really has given me this gift of life and being who I am. So even though I am not going to form a relationship with him in that way, I don't really feel like there's anything missing at all. I feel like I know, how I relate to the world. I know where I belong in a family and multiple families, thankfully. Yeah, that's how it is.
Another question is, how did your perception of the donor change over time? Like the first idea when you understood you were donor conceived, and then how it morphed and evolved.
I can say for myself, because of my situation where my father who raised me passed, when I found out that I was donor conceived, there was always this thought in the back of my mind, like, oh, there's also this other father out there, sort of. And so I would sort of think about, like, who is this person, knowing that they weren't going to ever be like a parent, but I definitely was really excited about the possibilities for what that connection would bring, if that makes sense. And when I finally did find him, and he rejected he was not interested in any kind of communication whatsoever. He didn't even write back himself. He had his sister write back. It was really heartbreaking at first. And so at first I just felt really rejected. And then it kind of like took a while for me to just understand that it wasn't personal and that it had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with him. And over time, now my opinion has sort of just changed about him. Like, okay, he was just this guy who donated in his 20s. He was a kid, essentially, who made a rash decision, got some money, and that's what it was for him, So at the end of the day, it's his loss. It's really not mine, is what I've come to realize.
Anybody else want to answer that?
Yes, I can. So as I was younger, I guess my perception of him was just this big question mark, this number in my head, because that's literally what I called him. That's what he was. It was, this sample, I guess, so to speak. And as I got, I always knew if I ever did get to meet him, it would never be like he's my father and like stepping into this role. And I never had any real expectation of meeting him. It was always just like a little childhood dream. Like one day I'm going to go find him and, maybe we'll get to talk or something. And for a while, I was totally content with just knowing him as this number in my mind that connected me to a bunch of other people that I loved and cared about. And that if I could find out when I'm 18, then I'll find out. Can't do anything till I'm 18 and try. For a while when I did turn 18, I tried to contact him through the sperm bank. And then they would contact him using the information that he gave however many years ago. And there was no response. So for a period of time there, it was maybe around a year or so before I found out, who he was, and then found him soon afterward. I just was accepting that, he did something in his 20s, and that now I'm here and I'm me because of it, and that's that. But as I got to know him, I really just valued him more as a person and got to really put a face to all the names and ideas I had of him. And to be able to see so much of myself in somebody else was an otherworldly experience. So although we don't talk now, I think of him as a positive person in the distance who's living his own life, and that I'm thankful for.
When I discovered this information and I got in touch with my bio dad, like I mentioned before, I was like 3 days in. And at that point, I was dealing with the trauma of the discovery, this is being half Jewish, actually having siblings, like all these things. Like at that point, I hadn't even gotten around to really processing what it meant to be donor conceived. Well, what I was doing was I was just throwing myself into the experience and just like, okay, I'm gonna just embrace everything that's true, because might sound cliche, but yeah, the truth will set you free and all that. But I'll never forget, it was approximately about a year ago. It was in like April of last year when I had my first video call with my bio dad. And he explained to me at the time, like he was in med school, he was doing his master's, and he, among his friends, was one of the few that was selected to be a sperm donor. And he was paid, and he would go to the clinic 3 times a week, drop off a sample, collect some compensation. And for him, he explained it. He actually truly believed that he was helping families in need. And in the city where I was born, I hesitate to use the word donate, just as this quick sidebar, because he was paid for his sperm, so like as he was selling his gametes, for lack of a better way of putting it, in the years to follow, when he would walk around parks and he would see kids that would roughly be around our age, he told me, he goes, I would blow kisses in the park wondering, are any of you my kids? Because he truly didn't know. And he mentioned that with the day that one of my sisters contacted him and found him was one of the greatest days of his life. And now, I mean, I speak to him almost, like we have video calls every couple weeks. With some of my siblings, it's a little bit more. Others, it's a little less. But where I am just so grateful for knowing him is because like I mentioned, I never saw myself reflected in my family, my raising family. But it's astounding to me how similar him and I are. And why I think so highly of him is that he is showing up for us, and he is taking responsibility for his choice in the early 1980s. And at that time, social media didn't exist. Cheap DNA testing didn't exist. And in fact, at the clinic that my parents went to, you could only be a client if you were married a certain number of years and heterosexual. So, things have changed quite a bit since then. But he is owning his responsibility. He is there for us in any way that we need him, even if it's, little involvement or lots of involvement. And why that has been such a gift for me is because I see that I have the same sort of capacity for compassion, love, and generosity because I come from him. And in seeing his greatness, I'm able to comfortably lean into the things that have always felt natural to me. And I can't even tell you the gift that is, that he has given me through that, and by extension, my siblings.
Well said. Beautiful statement. I want to point out that if any of the audience has questions, you can put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll look for them. I'll pose a question while we wait, but please feel free to ask your questions. I think we have one. How has being donor conceived impacted your thoughts about your physical health, maybe health concerns for your future, or your conversations with your own medical providers?
So that was one of the things that I was really interested in, why it was really important to me to find my donor. Was because I was wondering what my medical history is, because I am 35 years old and I am hoping to be a mother myself someday, and I wanted to make sure I had an accurate medical history so I don't pass on, a question mark. My kids can know what theirs is as well. I don't think like people really even think that far about all of this, about how it doesn't just affect your donor conceived child, it affects their children and their children and their children. You fill out medical forms your whole life, and they always ask what runs in the family. So there's tons of donor conceived people out there writing wrong answers, because they're not being told the truth. I got a very vague medical history from my donor. But I definitely think about this constantly because I want to be a mom someday, and I plan on getting a lot of testing done when that time comes, just to make sure I have the information that I need. But again, that's why I think that it's really important that donor conceived people are told their status and always know and have access to all of this information, because it's not just something that affects them in a psychological kind of way. It affects our health as well.
So this is sort of related, and I should explain how I want to convey it. So I know this isn't exactly physical health, but in my donor father's side of the family, mental health issues do run in the family. And this was something that me and my half siblings noticed. I'm very open about mental health and talking about it freely. And we all noticed that we struggled with different mental health issues growing up that were not related to the fact that we were donor conceived or any kind of psychological turmoil in that sense. We all tend to be, neurodivergent in the sense that, I suffer from misophonia. It has to do with an extra, neural connections in certain areas of the brain, to put it very, very, very loosely. And some other of my siblings, one of them has synesthesia, which is also extra neural connections in the brain. And all these, seemingly unrelated mental health, conditions. And these things weren't explicitly disclosed, even in all the information and medical information that my mother was given, because a lot of these things do have a stigma and they aren't talked about. And since they aren't physical health issues, a lot of the times it's ignored the importance of listing those on, on anything that they tell the families. So that's something that has impacted me. And has impacted just how I view nature versus nurture. Because even though I did have such a great relationship with my mother and all these things, there are some, outstanding, possibly genetic, things going on that do predispose me to certain issues and certain conditions. So I did want to bring that up as well.
Thank you.
On my end, just very briefly, I've talked a little bit about some physical health stuff with my bio dad. He's mentioned to me he has sleep apnea. The truth of the matter is, for me, I still actually haven't even really gotten around to processing this part of my discovery yet. 15 months later, I'm still contending with still the change. And for me, it's the mental health challenges that I have to deal with now, that I didn't have to deal with, that I never had pre-discovery, and managing that, managing my emotions and being able to self-regulate. I deal with things such as disassociation at times, and very, very strong hypervigilance, where I'll have shakes in my feet sometimes if I'm, for no reason. It's just that's where my body temperature is. Constantly wondering what the next sort of bomb to drop is. So, but one of the things I guess that is somewhat related that has been good is my bio dad is now semi-retired, but when he was working full time was an accomplished child and adolescent psychiatrist. And when I began doing a lot of the personal healing work from childhood, specifically around things like narcissistic personality disorder and intergenerational trauma, doing that work came quite easy to me. And I never really understood why. And in fact, the only thing that came easier to me, other than this work and understanding the concepts, was playing guitar, which is, as an activity, the thing I can do better than anything else on the planet. And I think that one of the reasons why a lot of the recovery work for me and the mental health work has come natural is entirely related to who my bio dad is and his expertise in areas of strength. But the physical health stuff, like I haven't even gotten around to that yet. But I know I have to watch out for sleep apnea potentially.
I think that what Dan's talking about is a perfect segue to a question I would love to hear all of your answers on. Is there any advice you would give intended parents who are at the beginning of their family building journey?
The first thing I would say is that anonymity no longer exists. It in 2022, it does not exist. Because all it takes is if I decide that I don't want to sell my sperm for whatever reason, and I go to a sperm bank and I sell them my gametes and all that, and I don't want to be contacted. I want to be anonymous. All it takes is one person in my family, like a cousin or an uncle or whomever, to test on Ancestry for someone to connect to me. It's that easy. And in fact, that's how my sister found our bio dad, because she got matched with like an uncle or someone, and then she did all the work to find our bio dad. So number one, I mean, anonymity it does not exist anymore. The other thing I would also mention, and I would strongly recommend any parent, potential parents who are thinking about this, is to use a known donor. Having the biological father or a biological mother in the situation of egg donation around during the child's most formative years is just so important. And when things are in the open, shame doesn't have to fester. It doesn't have to grow. And it's actually in the best interest for everybody. And, one of the things that I heard so often, and Joni, you talked about in your presentation, is hearing how parents say to their donor-conceived children, well, you were so wanted. We wanted you so much. And I certainly heard that myself. So then what I would say to that, is if you're going to go through all this trouble to get something that you want so much, there's enough information out there now that can help you have a great experience for you and your donor-conceived children. And then finally, I would say, listen to the voices of donor-conceived people, because the donor-conceived child will only be a child for a certain number of years. They're going to be a donor-conceived adult for many more decades than they will be a child. And people like myself, Terry and Aaron, like we are we're the living proof of what our experience is like. And what I would challenge any recipient parent or someone who wants to use donor conception to start a family is say, well, what happens if your child feels differently about the nature of their conception and their donor conception story? What are you going to do to help them in their journey if they feel differently than you? Like, what if they feel that love doesn't make a family? What if they feel that genetics do matter? How are you going to help them in there navigate some of those hard questions? And I know I certainly wish that my parents, did this, but I donor conception it's not as simple as just going to a clinic and going through a catalog and picking a biological parent for your child. It is so much more complex and multi-layered than that. And you really need to know what you're getting yourselves into before you take that step. And you can learn a lot from listening to the voices of donor conceived people, both early discovery and late.
Thank you.
I'd piggyback on all of what Dan just said. Absolutely. Listening to the voices of donor conceived people and their many different experiences is really, really helpful, and trying to not be defensive about it, but instead listening with the spirit of compassion. I would also let them know that, when you want to have a child, you want to love that child unconditionally. That's what a parent's job is supposed to be, is to love their child unconditionally. And if you leave out specific information that is so foundational for your child, and you don't share with them that they are donor conceived, that's conditional love. So I would really, really encourage you to make sure that you give your child all of those tools, like I said, all the tools in their toolbox, because we're all of us are out there as human beings trying to figure out who we are. We're all building an identity. That's like the goal of all of our human lives, is to build our own identity. So as your child is building their little tower, you don't want to give them false foundation, and so that when it's ripped away, their whole tower falls down. I love imagery, so that was my imagery I just gave. But yeah, I would just say, just make sure love and honesty is always at the forefront, and you really can't go wrong, honestly.
I think I would say to support and encourage your child to explore that side of themselves, because it is going to be a part of them whether you like it or not. In being a recipient parent, it's very important to recognize that this, gift that you're being given, this donation, whatever you want to call it, it's going to affect your child. It's going to affect who they are and how they identify, and, smaller things as well. So to be able to go into it knowing that I am going to support my child on however they want to relate to this, and encourage your children to, maybe try to meet their half siblings. It's not going to take away from anything that they have at your raising family. The family that raised me is my family, and period. I love them to the ends of the earth. But you can never have too much family, in my opinion. So having this extended network of people who are like me, of people who can provide a safe space for me, I feel like I've grown so much as a person. So, my advice would be to let your children be curious and support them on their journey.
Thank you. And I'll add 2 cents here. Going right back to where we started, parents have been told to tell early and often. And I think to really hold on that early telling is so much easier for you as a parent and for your kid. Your kid will always know. There'll never be that body memory moment of shock where their world is rocked and they learn that it's different than what they thought. They will just always know it. And starting early gives your kid time to metabolize this at each stage and development as they deserve and as they need. And early telling gives you, as parents, the chance to metabolize your grief, your loss, your shame, your fear, your anxiety, and to seek out help if you need it, because help is there, whether it is from clinicians or listening to donor-conceived persons. Get on board with it, because you really want to give your kids and teens the tools they need to live their own story. That's what they really need to do. So thank you. And if there's any other question, I'll pop myself in the chat box. I think there is. Okay. How am I dealing with my personal journey? There's a question. Okay. I'm 4 years into it. I think we have found that 3 years is a sweet spot. Past the absolute floating on air, the world does not feel normal anymore. The emotions are strong. I had a lot of feelings about it. Probably most useful for this is that as a person who knew so much about this intellectually, it didn't help that much emotionally. It was still a shock. I was very, very angry at having not been told the truth, and very, very sad that my dad, like Erin's dad, was deceased, and that we could never have the real conversation. And I still feel sad about this. You know, I love you. You didn't have to feel shame. It would have all been okay. And that's a loss forever for me. And I feel really badly about that. I also feel badly that my dad died also on the, younger side, that I grew up thinking I was going to inherit what he died of. And I was terrified. And I wouldn't have had to have lived with that. But the silver lining, as you're beginning to hear, is I have a 92-year-old dad that I adore. And in about 3 weeks, I'm flying out to California to make a birthday party for him with my new half sister. And I'll be meeting my 2 half brothers, all his marriage children. And I've been very lucky in that department. And like each person you heard here, it is so easy to meet biological family. There's like an unspoken comfort, and it feels extremely grounding and uplifting at the very same time. And I love that. So that would be my last thought. Okay. Thank you. And I hope this is really helpful. And I know it's going to be a video. And I really hope this is shared with recipient parents, because our motive really here was to help them feel more comfortable and to help them help their kids. And I hope that message came across nice and strong. Thanks.
Thank you, Joni, Dan, Terry, Erin, and Kara, who's in the background. Thank you so much for moderating such an enlightening and emotional session. Thank you to our attendees who I think this is the first of 90-minute session. Thank you for staying with us and listening to our stories. Please note that this session was recorded, and you will receive a notification when it's ready on our ASRM website. Right after this session and on an email, you'll receive a survey. Please share your feedback, because that helps us give you the most relevant content, and we appreciate your inputs. Once again, thank you so much. And please note that the session was recorded. And if you have any further questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us at webinars@asrm.org. This concludes the webinar. Thank you.
Okay.